Okay.
Here we go.
Maureen, why don't you say what it is, since we didn't have the opening on it, if someone looks at it afterward, that the date and that's the
Right.
Quaker study.
Right, and I can put a title on. So this is the second session of consideration of the book Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. And we've been providing the participants with some selected readings within that material because it is wonderfully in depth. But as I said, particularly for this section, there's a lot of material when we get to about mid-20th century that I know a number of you have connections to, whether it was Quaker schools or Quaker colleges or other things like that. So we're not going to go in detail into those things, but in general, do feel free to share a story, a brief story about your experiences. I think that's going to be very enriching. And the freedom to do that is partly, I do have some things planned out for the third session. There's a couple of Quaker Speak videos, including one with Vanessa, that's going to be very interesting, I think. But we'll still have time to take up topics again if we run out of time tonight. So I've just got some brief notes like Dwight did last time. As we move into the 20th century, we find core commitments that Quakers continue to have. Inspiration to do the work must arise from the spirit. So that's carrying forward over the centuries, really. But large changes come also, and they're including both Hicksite and Orthodox Friends. I'm not going to go into this convoluted history of Friends, but we've had splits over the centuries, and that these branches of Quakerism, Hicksite and Orthodox, continue to work on this issue together was actually a very good sign. A number of key Quaker organizations came to be after the beginning of the century. We have Friends General Conference in 1900, and in their original mandate for themselves, they included social justice. Then we have American Friends Service Committee forming in 1917. This arises out of giving Quaker men, young men, an alternative to going to war, to World War I. So that was the initial impetus for American Friends Service Committee. And then they moved on into other social justice. Particularly, I think you saw the first 20, 30 years of the century, the issues around lynching, just horrendous. And that did get a lot of attention. And then, let's see. Oh, I wanted to add that later on, since we have some friends with Friends Committee on National Legislation, that arises out of World War II. That was 1942. Now, African Americans themselves started to form organizations. So it wasn't just they were relying upon white people to do things. The NAACP formed in 1909 and the National Urban League in 1911. So there were groups to work with. And of course, for African Americans themselves in that early 20th century is the Great Migration. So you have, for those of you who have read The Warmth of Other Suns, thank you, by Isabel Wilkerson, this massive upflow from the South, fleeing Jim Crow and looking for better lives was really part of that. And it leads to an urbanization also that becomes very clear by the time we get to mid-century. So that's a very important part of the African-American story. The other thing that struck me amongst this was that the tactics Friends were using are things we still use today. Speeches inviting African American speakers to come to their meetings, newsletters about social, racial justice, workshops, dialogues between Quaker meetings and local African Americans, organizing conferences. There was a lot of information on regional and national conferences. They were all trying to build a force. So recognizing that Quakers or Friends were fairly small congregations, they were trying to build up a force to include as many people as possible to help work on these issues. Another familiar theme, and this quote was from a 1928 survey one of the organizations, or I think one of the conferences, had sent out looking for feedback. And one person had written, "I do not say that Friends are more prejudiced or indifferent than others, but I cannot say that they are appreciably less when it came to racism." And so the call would go out over and over again, the need for Friends to look at themselves as well as the exterior. This whole section of part 2 has different sort of ways of being in the world. It covered economic justice, activist Friends aware of the connection between the economic structure and racism urged Friends to be more conscious of where funds were involved or invested. And it's interesting, that same question has come up in this last 20 years or so around climate change. So that question comes up early and continues. And for me, which I have not had, which I'd like to study further, is it leads us then into, although we've talked about where our meetings extra resources are invested, what's being raised up most recently is where inherited resources and how those are being handed down. We baby boomers control the largest amount of wealth in the history of the world. American baby boomers. We have been so privileged. Now, the question always is, does that just get passed down to families as it has in the past? Or does something bigger happen out of it? And families are starting to grapple with that as grandparents are writing wills and considering these things. And I think that is really right for, I would just say personally that because Dwight and I don't have children, maybe it's more poignant for us. We have family, but I don't know. It's just something that personally has come up for me in the last year or so. So then we get to the 1950s and 60s, mid-century. And of course, this is a time of both hope and turmoil. One of the strong messages is that the African-American leadership is stepping forward. We have all kinds of organizations, both under King and under SNCC. And then finally, we get into even Black Power. So this whole period into the 70s also, of course, is a time of much questioning among meetings. And there were mixed messages. There's no doubt about it. I hope you were able to read those things. And it really challenged meetings. The Black Manifesto clearly called out for not just Quakers, but churches across the board to take what they had built up in wealth over the generations, a lot of it built on slave labor. In case you've read the most recent report out of Georgetown University and the Jesuits, that's a piece of it. And they called for money to be put into a foundation that would actually fund things like business development, education, and whatever. And there was a lot of pushback, no doubt about it. And a lot of fear who actually went on the 1963 March on Washington. You know, there evidently were not a lot of Quaker leaders who took it up. So I think that's something that's sort of a part of our history, whether we were there or not. And then switching gears, but as I said earlier, this is where things may really touch some of you more clearly. We get into the integration of Quaker schools. So just as Brown versus the Board of Education was talking about public schools, Quaker schools, whether we're talking about elementary, high school, colleges, were all being questioned and challenged. One thing that happened is the decreasing Quaker population into the 20th century put a number of Quaker schools, particularly I think, from what I understand, these are grammar schools or high schools, put them under a problem that if they were going to financially survive, they probably had to open their doors to more students, and not just Quaker students. And from one thing I read, it appeared it wasn't such a big issue if it was opening the doors to Jewish people, Mexicans, Asians, but it was a very big deal about whether they would integrate with African American students. Some of them were frankly concerned that if they did that, the rest of the school population would leave. That there was still such clear pushback. And some of it, I think before I read this book, I hadn't even thought about it. This is particularly high school and then colleges. The fear was intermarriage, that parents did not want their children marrying people outside their race. There was also some mention that it would be difficult for the African American students themselves, that just a couple or a handful of students were admitted to an all-white school. It'd be awkward for everyone. It was this paternalistic. One person mentions, but nobody kind of planned for it. You know, it was just a fear. We hear these fears rising up again. Not to say it wasn't true. Maria shared a story earlier today from a friend of hers. Then when we get to the second half of the 20th century, schools that are being formed then, and one example is 1961, Cambridge School at Cambridge, Massachusetts, created by the meeting. And they very consciously put in their goals social justice, and deciding where they would put their school, right in the middle of Cambridge, not the wealthy part of Boston, were very conscious efforts. And maybe later I'll share with you, this suddenly caused me to think about where Framingham Meeting, which is where Dwight and I first found Quakers in Massachusetts, where it got located in somewhere in the 60s as a preparatory meeting. Yeah. So this has really sparked looking back over some of our history. And then there's a final quote. This is quite an extensive section. So there did become a period when Friends schools realized and promoted the beneficial effects of integration. And this was a quote by Germantown Friends School Committee member Aisha Imani, who was of African descent. It is my fervent belief that the surest antidote to racism is our realization that we actually need each other. We need each other not merely for cultural enrichment, but to see truth and to build institutions based on the truth that we see. And I think that taking it beyond the cultural enrichment, I know some of the earliest training I got in bias seemed to focus a little bit too much about that. There's a benefit to white people to dealing with these issues because it will enrich our culture. It's kind of a way to sell doing the work. I think this calls it out, that there's something much deeper and much more difficult. There's truth to be involved. So that's sort of an introduction. And we'll just go back to opening it up. And you can unmute yourselves. I had provided 4 questions at the beginning of this whole process. So you may choose, it may help you on something you'd like to share. What surprised you in the readings? Where have historical practices carried forward? What themes have you found across time and locations? Where have there been generational differences? Kathy, did I see Kathy wanted to? No, I guess not. We've lost her.
Maureen, will you read those questions again, please?
Yeah. What surprised you in the readings? Where have historical practices carried forward? What themes have you found across time and locations? Where have there been generational differences? Kathy, did you want to speak? No, okay. I'll just unmute her.
Maria, go ahead.
What struck me over and over again in the readings was how young people have consistently been ahead of their parents and their parents' parents. And I was again grateful for the young people in our meeting who are moving us to address the terrible racial injustice in the quote justice system. And I think probably without that push, it would be so easy to just say yes, yes. It's such a shame. Another thing that I'm grateful for is Friends Center for Children. And from its outset, the desire, not the desire, but the intention and the follow through to include children across the socioeconomic spectrum, regardless of means, so that at least for a period in their lives, the children who go to Friends Center are encouraged and have access to the same wonderful, nurturing education. What happens after they leave is a worry to me. You know, that still privileged parents, privileged white parents for the most part, have the means to put their children in private schools if the public schools are not adequate. You know, we still have that problem in New Haven, but at least for Friends Center, that's not the case. And I'm grateful for that.
Actually, Friends Center has managed all these years now. It's been 10 or 12 years. It has no racial, ethnic, or economic majority. And it really looks like New Haven, which also is a non-majority town. It's not every aspect of the board is doesn't look exactly like the students. The staff does, and obviously the parents do. So, but we're working on the board to get it to be as much like, to reflect what the student body looks like. I was struck in reading the book. I was very interested in the book, but just how consistent the ambivalence, the hesitation, the conservative fear, there's a lot of so much push-pull consistently across all this time between, instead of, and it helps me think about Quakers not as, when you think, oh, wow, they were such abolitionists and they were so great. Well, there was all the fear and the ambivalence and the hesitation of every sort all the way through. And there were people who were way out front and were very courageous, and there were people who were really not, and really dragged their feet and reflected exactly the kinds of racist attitudes that were prevalent in the societies they lived in. And I think that's probably still the case. So it made me think about what Quakers are doing as so really aspirational, not something that we've accomplished, but it's something where what we're trying to do for ourselves is they're worthy things, but it's not anything that we've done. And so it requires this constant self-examination to see how we've failed to do what we aspire to do. And it's inspiring to keep trying to do that, but it's so consistent across everything that's talked about in this book. I'm studying something from the early 19th century in Quaker history, and exactly the same thing shows up there. So I'm very grateful for the book. I mean, it really is a very good mirror for us.
Peggy?
Yeah, I was really surprised by the Black Manifesto, and they're demanding $500 million in reparations from the racist white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. I don't remember what year this is, but it looked like New York meeting actually wanted to commit to 1% of their members' income for the year, which would have been 120,000, and they didn't raise much, 19,000 the first year, and then they later raised 47,000. And they donated to various projects. But I thought that was pretty amazing that they were actually thinking of asking all their members to donate 1% of their income. I mean, that's a real commitment. And it only mentions New York. I don't know how many other people, groups did. Yeah. But I wonder if they asked for reparations today, what would we be willing to commit financially? I mean, that was a huge step for the New York meeting to, and that they made the demand, because there's been a lot of talk recently about reparations, and I hadn't really thought about approaching churches for money.
The Jesuits just gave $100 million.
I saw that today.
It's nowhere near enough.
No.
They sold like 300 enslaved people or something like that at one point to raise money.
Yeah.
One of the courses that Pendle Hill is, I don't remember if it's already been offered or if it's a future offering, has a reparations component where a financial contribution is expected.
So that's
That's part of
built into the registration fee.
I don't know, it's not part of the registration fee, but it's understood that the participants in the course will be contributing financially in a way that's similar to reparations.
I've been, there's a new book out called From Here to Equality by William Darity and Kirsten Mullen. And I've been working my way through it with my friend Jerry Leapart, because we had done some work on reparations 10 years ago. And the Jesuits mentioned it's a very good history book. It's got not only footnotes, but endnotes, and it just leads you down, with the resources of the internet these days, you can expand any number of topics, but I think the time might be right for some more of these reparations discussions. As an example, there was a Gilder Lehrman Center symposium forum about the Yale and slavery project that's going on. And they had 4 students talk about their research into some of it. And it was amazing. The quality of the students' work was great. And the students raised the issue of reparations during the program. So it's a hot topic. And you can see it comes up as Jane was saying, in the readings that we've had. But doesn't always go very far. Not far enough.
Well, Gabby had made sure we knew about that. So that's actually, I'll look up, I should be able to find that online. This particular webinar.
It's on Facebook, it's on YouTube. If you
Is
go
it?
on.
Oh, I
Yeah.
tried to find it. It wasn't clear that they were recording it. So it's there?
Yeah, I had to look at it on YouTube too, because I had to miss the session when it was live.
Oh, great.
I highly recommend it. It was an excellent, just really excellent, and about what happened here at Yale goes all the way back to the 1700s. Was really excellent.
And what continues to happen. I was just moved by the students talking about they're facing racism on the campus every day. And expect better.
That's part of
But there's also one of the colleges is located on slave quarters. They call it you used to call it the slave quarters. In fact,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Can somebody provide the name of this so that we can find it on YouTube?
I'll include it in your readings for the next, for
Okay.
session 3.
Thank you, Fran.
yeah, I watched part of it too. I thought it was very informative, very informative.
Well, it's part of a year-long study of Yale and slavery, Yale's relationship to slavery, and there'll be a big report coming out. So there's a whole team of researchers working on it. The students are part of it, but there are librarians and faculty members and community members and all kinds of, it's a big effort. And within about a year, they may have it all pulled together into a report.
Yeah, I was going to mention that there was an article in Friends Journal a few months back by a friend in Michigan, and she's been talking about reparations, and she went to some leaders of the Black Lives Matter, and the biggest issue among a lot of the young leaders is these huge student loan debts that they're carrying. And they identified just a few of them, and they realized adding up all their student loan debts was over $1,300,000. And that this keeps activists from actually working on the movement because they have these huge student loan debts. And so she's starting a program some of these activists said, could you just lend us the money to pay off the loans and we'll pay you back? And she goes, wait a minute, we should just be paying off their loans for them. We owe them so much. And so she's starting a whole movement about Quakers taking on paying off student loan debt for people of color, which I think is very worthy of our time and attention.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
You know, I was struck by, I love this book so much. I mean, it's just been so eye-opening for me. But I was rereading a section, and it had to do with Bayard Rustin and Barrington Dunbar. It's in a part of the chapter called Understanding Black Power, and it's on 306. And they accused Quakers of being part and parcel of the institutional violence of American society, and a covert violence, a day-to-day violence that is perpetuated by whites on Black Americans over 300 years. And as allies of this system, Dunbar charged friends were as guilty as our kind of violence as the militant Black nationalist is of his kind. And that, I just finished Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, and
Between the World and Me.
Between the World and Me. And that whole book, I mean, it's such a poignant book. He's writing to his 15-year-old, 16-year-old son, and talking about that systemic violence that is white-based, and it's inherent in white society. And he calls it the dream, and it's suburban, and but it started with slavery and then moved into various kinds of systemic violence with redlining and with kind of tax codes and voting suppression and those kind of things. And so the reparations go back to slavery, but it continues all the way through. So it hasn't ended. And Coates talked about being afraid for his body. He talks about his body, that's where the attack lies, is on his body, and the murdered Black body. And that, he's talking to his son about how dangerous it is to be Black, and so that is something that it's just really struck me deep, because we talk about the peace testimony, and how, we're, assuming that as Quakers, that we're, embracing peace, and yet we're allies to this system just by the color of our skin, and that we live without that fear of our bodies being broken as we go out into the community. Anyway, it's a privilege that we have, that it's one of those invisible white privileges. And Coach just made it very clear how debilitating that is every day. It's a day-to-day thing. You never know when it's going to hit. You never know when you're going to be stopped. You never know when what the consequences are going to be. So to me, there's a need for a systemic overhaul as well, that has something to address that issue of that we have a different world than people of color do. And it is systemic, and it is based on privilege, and it's based on privilege that we don't want to let up. We don't want to give up. Anyway, that was just a very powerful section for me.
There.
I couldn't help but find myself at many junctures saying to myself, what if at this moment Quakers had gone the more radical route? What if at this point especially this point, we didn't take so long to let those who came to us and said, we want to be members, be members. I just, you know, and to know that there were people who, even though they were not given, membership was not extended to them, continued to come. And there was absolutely no rationale. So I've really been thinking about how that would have changed us if we had been open at that time. And there are many other points along the way where we could have opened up and had more of a membership that is diverse, and we simply didn't. And I think the elephant in the room is getting down to talking about bodies and talking about the fear of two groups of people coming together intimately. And that fear is a driving force that we skirt around. It's one of the reasons that we allowed zoning regulations go into our communities that restricted certain people from being able to come in and live amongst us. If you follow all the laws that started to get set up so that segregation started to become a way of life, a lot of it is really based on that fear of getting to know each other and becoming intimates. Whether it's intimate through friendship or intimate through romance and marriage, there's a real fear of being close, of intimacy.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a study group on caste right now, Isabel Wilkerson, you know, and to me, we do as Quakers suffer from the privileges of caste, and we're invisible to it too. And that our meeting is taking this on and really looking at how we as Quakers are perpetuating the caste system in the United States. And that just, you know, and one of the tentacles of caste is this purity of keeping things pure and not being polluted by people of color or blacks, you know. Yeah. And so many things about Quakerism, they're basic to the tenements of they hold caste in place. So we have a lot of work to do. And I just think that how willing are we to go really deep and not stay superficial on what God is talking to us. What is God saying to us? And I know it's going to take a lot of work because I can see that historically, you know, this book was great. I just really love this book. It pointed out how a lot of Quakers were in the forefront, but they couldn't get their meetings to follow along with them. You know, what was keeping meetings from supporting them and instead of disowning them? And you know, what has kept, you know, we were great at starting schools, but yet we weren't great at integrating them. You know, or we just dropped them after a while. After the Civil War, we started all these schools and then we dropped them and assumed that, okay, you're free now, you can take care of your own schools, having no concept about what was happening in the lives of people of color. Like, there's just this disconnect of what their actual lived experience of people of color are. And that looking at it from their white perspective and thinking that they know something. I just think that we need to be listening a lot deeper.
Well, thank you for that, Carolyn. I have the copy of the book that I've been working with is original sort of copied from the author's first edition or something like that before it went to print because I can write it. And I wrote the first time I read the book and in the margins. And what I'm struck by is my comments that say, we're still doing that. And we keep trying this and it never works. And I get a little bit disappointed because, like you said, Carolyn, so many times we've gone a little bit of a ways down the right path and then dropped the ball or gotten afraid or just botched it up. I'd like to feel optimistic that something's going to change, but I don't see any evidence of it. So find some evidence. Bring it.
Yeah,
to
I
light.
just think that wonder if we're really willing to go deeper into our own of listening for the word, listening with what the voice is telling us inside. Like there are people who come up with these things and take action and do something. And where are the rest of us? I mean, I obviously they're talking to us, but are we listening to them? Are we really listening deep enough and fully enough with an open heart? Or what is it going to take our hearts to open up? I mean, these are questions I'm grappling with because I'm trying to figure out why we're kind of stuck. And I see it in our meeting. I see it in our yearly month. I see it in our yearly meeting. I see it in our national groups. I see it in FCNL. They're grappling with this. FCNL is grappling with this. So we're all grappling with it, and the grappling is great. But what brings about this light? Seeing the light. That we talk about this so famous with Quakers is holding people in the light, but seeing.
Wendy?
Well,
Wendy.
no, I think Leslie was next.
Oh, Leslie, sorry.
Did you have something?
Well, I'm not sure if it's fully formed, friends, but I guess I've been thinking a lot and particularly as I read these sections that I was remembering the time when our New Haven meeting decided to get a building. And what I found myself questioning is what happens when friends essentially become institutional, whether that's school, whether that's property, how do we call ourselves to be in tension with that? I mean, there are very good reasons to have a building. I'm not fundamentally questioning that, but do we also recognize what happens to the spirit, what happens to our priorities, what happens to our vision if we don't somehow find very disciplined ways to look at how we're spending our money, how we're behaving as a corporate body, how we are challenging ourselves to do better? Because so much of what I saw in the readings was a natural, understandable, human failing pattern of becoming of the world, I would say, using sort of religious terminology there, but caring about the bottom line, caring about the social standing, becoming part of the elite fabric that would have protected the institutions, and that is as real a threat for us as it was for Westtown Friends or anybody else. So I don't have an answer. It's to me a fundamental question. What is the source and how do we deepen it and protect it and challenge ourselves to listen to that, even if it's uncomfortable when it comes to our institutions, if you will. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Wendy?
Well, I have two different thoughts, and I'm not really sure where to start. I think the first is about reparations. And so often reparations is talked about in terms of dollars, finances. And, you know, friends, everybody has trouble talking about finances. So, so it's a hard topic, but to me, it really goes back to the quote that Maureen mentioned at the beginning of the real need. Reparations means how do you repair the damage that's been done, and that's sure part of that is financial, but the main part is the institutionalization and changing it. So to me, there's so many deep issues, and reparations is one thing. If you're talking about finances, okay, so if you all everyone agrees to give money, you do it and it's done, but it's not going to make it go away. It needs to be done at a very deeper level. And it means internal searching of ourselves, but it means, you know, it's a long-term process. Am I going to have a long enough life to be able to make a dent in that? And then what happens to the people who come? I mean, this is a multi-generational effort. It is not going to happen in a short time. Anyway. So there's that. Then this is the total flip side. I just was reveling in so many of the details about Philadelphia, where I grew up, and all the things that were going on there. And I discovered something that my parents never told me, that my next door neighbor was Richard Dick Taylor and his wife Phyllis, and we carpooled with their kids to Germantown Friends School. They were Quakers, but I never knew what the two of them did what they did as Quakers, and it was huge. I mean, they did where do I start? I guess the first thing they did. Going to homes when suburban home areas would not sell to Blacks, and they turned them away, and they would go in as a couple saying they were interested in the house.
Yeah.
And they would let them buy it. Well, they weren't going to buy it. So they did all this stuff over decades, and very quiet. They lived next door to us. Hardly ever saw him. I think he was just working. So anyway, that was a real personal eye opener, that there are these people out there doing things very quietly that we don't know about. The other was, you know, I had different feelings about this idea of friend schools, where there was this protected environment for the Quaker kids. But when I was at Germantown Friends, the school decided not to move. They were offered land to move out to the suburbs and to leave Germantown, which at the time was, and it still is, it's a very inner city. It's a tough neighborhood. And a lot of these white parents were, you know, concerned about it, maybe, I don't know, but the school decided, no, we're staying here in Germantown. And it was at that same time they started bringing Black students into the school. There were a few there, but there was a much more concerted effort. And that, for me, for all the years I was there, I got to meet the most incredible students who were brought in. There was Priscilla, who came from Rhodesia and lived here in the US and came to Germantown Friends School. There were 3 different guys who lived in the Germantown area who came. One was biracial, and these other, it was really hard for them. Not so much the Rhodesian girl, but the local kids. It was very, very tough. But man, people we learned so much from one another. People became very close in these small classes. So, I read in the book about, and everyone's saying how slow we were to change, but again, it's that everything takes time. Nothing is going to happen and change on a dime. It means persistence and time. So anyway, I hear everybody's frustration, but I think we all have to be realistic. I'm not going to live to see, I might see some changes, but institutional racism is not going to go away in my lifetime. I can help try to move it that way, but it's not going to happen quickly. And persistence is one of the hardest things. And I think that's why Quakers have backed away from a lot of these issues. You get worn out, you get exhausted. So anyway, that's it for me. But I just have to say, the whole Philadelphia connection, I'm going to go back and be reading this with a toothpick, because there's so many names and so many people I know that I'm learning a lot about these people who, I really didn't know very well. So it's been fun.
No, I was thinking of you, Wendy, on a lot of these sections. I'd like to turn.
Can I just jump in for a minute?
Okay, but I want to switch the conversation a little bit, but go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, I just want to say, along with Wendy, I also grew up near Philadelphia and found the same thing going on. And one of the experiences was that my parents took us to Friends General Conference, not from our Lansdowne Friends meeting, to Cape May, New Jersey. And Martin Luther King was giving his speech there.
Are you kidding?
I was 13.
Oh my gosh.
And so when that came up on the page, I mean, I've remembered it very many times throughout my life. It's been really a thread throughout my life. But when I saw it on the page, I literally, my body woke up and was electrified, because I can remember the timbre of his voice. I can remember how mesmerized I was and how I was just amazed at the language he used. And I was 13, but I could understand perfectly what he was saying about agape and unconditional love. And so I had a really great remembering and appreciation that it has influenced my life a lot. Also, at the same time, I had this awareness, sort of, something Michael said made me think about this piece of it, because it's, so if that's what happens in me with one little trigger of a good memory, when I think about the trauma and the generations of trauma that have occurred to Black people in particular, then I think how a trigger would just go through them like a hot wire. It just how incredibly different their experiences must be on such a frequent basis. And it gives me such a different consciousness about my white consciousness and my emotional life. So it came from Lansdowne Friends to Cape May to my awareness of that. And so that's all for right now. Oh, and I shared this with someone who said that Friends General Conference actually has a tape of that speech.
Oh,
Oh,
And so I'm going to try to obtain that tape, and I would love to share it because it was just amazing.
mm.
that'd be great.
Just have one comment.
Yeah.
Bonnie may remember, I'm just gonna use the initials because I don't know if I can use the person's name since we're recording. But the gentleman, I'll make it very short. The gentleman came to meeting. His initials are JJ. And I'm getting emotional thinking about it, but I'm just going to say that he challenged me, challenged meeting. I don't know if we lived up to the challenge as much as we could. Bonnie remembers, I'm sure. And, but I remember one wonderful thing he did. He was not a well man physically. And he went into New Haven, and just was during Rodney King riots, and he spoke to the folks in the community to calm things down so that that there would not be any kinds of rioting in New Haven area. And he spoke so much that he lost his voice for a while with that. There's a lot more. It would be hours for me to talk about the situation, but just holding him in the light and trying to work through that, just bringing those memories up of some of my frustrations, and I have recollections of sitting with him in Yale New Haven Hospital when he was not well. And yeah, so thank you, friends. Bonnie remembers, I'm sure. I think, yeah. So, yeah. I can't hear you, Bonnie, but.
I'm not alone in remembering.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, friend, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.
So my thought at this moment is, if there's anyone who hasn't spoken, who would like to share, maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. And then I'm going to pose a section of the book, a topic that for the next time, because I think this is really important. It's something I'm really struggling with. And I think we should carry it forward, but let's go ahead and finish. Are there others who haven't spoken who would like to share?
I was struck by how, as you go through the book, starting way back when, back in the day, as the kids say, way back in the day to now, how racial justice issues seem to come in waves in Quaker meetings, and the wave washes up and it recedes. And in every wave, there are the people that go beyond looking through the glass, maybe doing things behind the glass of white privilege, and those who open the door and step out and actually put themselves on the line. And Wendy's, the section about Wendy's neighbors, that was one that really stayed with me. The realtor who tried to find homes for Black people, and the meetings where people actually put up their own money they actually got very personally involved in things. Those were people that stepped out the door and didn't stay behind the glass. And I think we're in a similar moment right now where the tide is high. And so the question for us is, are we going to stay behind the glass or step out the door? The question I'm asking myself about my role in my suburban town and what needs to be done there.
Anyone else?
Mary had her hand up.
Yeah, to Barbara's point too about tides, one of the things that I was just kind of curious about is why do the tides come when they come, right? Like what else is going on? And I was thinking about how in the 1960s and 70s, the big deal thing that was also happening at the same time as the civil rights movement, of course, was the Vietnam War, right? And so it's just interesting to think of those two big deal things of civil rights and the Vietnam War and how they kind of what was the interplay there. And then I was thinking about the current high tide, if you will, in terms of the consciousness of this country now, and the role of the pandemic too in making people very aware of the way that people of color and people with far fewer resources are just suffering so much more than people, white people and people with resources. So just kind of looking at the bigger context, I found that interesting. Another thing, thinking about, what really worked. There's these themes that others have mentioned too of, getting frustrated because a lot of people are really agitating and really trying to do things. And then a sense of, well, we've only made this much progress. But to Wendy's point, this is really multi-generational long work. And so it really raises the question on if you're talking personal change, you have a lot of control over what you do. If you're talking societal change, there's just so many factors that factor into it. So it's going to be much slower when you have such big groups like that. So it just raised for me this whole question around, well, when you're talking really big systemic change, it's really interesting to see, well, what are the examples of actually what really did move the needle? What really worked? And it does, I think, Wendy, to your point, go back to some of these things that maybe were quieter, but the individual actions that, your neighbors took, or I couldn't believe how many people from around Philadelphia were really going and volunteering in all sorts of different ways in large numbers. There were things that were done that did move the needle. So I don't know, I just kind of, but I also hear sort of there were just so many instances of such great frustration too. And you look at the Black Panthers, or you look at that Black Manifesto, where people were just so frustrated, they were getting really, really strident. But then that caused sort of an equal and opposite reaction. People got really scared, right? And so, it prompted some people to move and other people kind of dug their heels in. So it's really interesting to see this kind of the push-pull that you spoke of earlier, Maureen, but how people approach change, I think, really was very consequential in how effective people were. And people had different methodologies for sure. And some were more effective than others. So that just really struck me. And also just how these themes around different approaches to change carry on through today, right? We have the full spectrum right here today. So history repeats itself.
Well, thank you, Mary, because I think that leads right into what I would hope we could dig into more next time for those who can return. I would like to dig into that whole issue about friends having a peace testimony and wanting to work with nonviolence for change and to step back when things get loud and violent. There are times in the 60s particularly. I think partly what's been happening for me is with this book, I am reminded it's 400 years. When we say to people, it's a big issue and it's just going to take time, how would I feel if I was being told that? Because, you know, my relatives came over at a certain time and I barely know if I'm going to be allowed to vote the next time around. That call for patience is also what has been consistent. And so now we're facing another period of time and we're having that conversation right within our meeting, which is good. So let's dig into it. Friends had multiple responses to the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, I wasn't here for it, but we're right in New Haven, right? And there are those of you who were here for that. How can we have the courage to see where the message is? It's not just frustration, it's downright fear, as you were saying, Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's whether it's the two sons of Susanna Holzenbeck, who just because their skins are darker might not live till they're 20, right? Can be in the best family, the best Quaker family, but they may not live to be adults in New Haven. That's how real it is for me these days. And so how do we grapple with that? I don't want for me the peace testimony to be, oh, it's okay to be quieter and to just focus on nonviolence and whatever. If you haven't seen the movie One Night in Miami, and there's Malcolm X,
Muhammad Ali,
Sam Cooke, and a football player.
James
Brown, the football player. That is, it's like right in your face. Sometimes you need a movie rather than a book to show you. And Malcolm was dead within 2 months. And Sam Cooke was dead.
Too, yeah.
He was a young musician because he came out with one song that challenged the status quo. So I would hope they would spend some time next time around. So I'd like you to think about that. Go back and reread and think about the parallels of Black Lives Matter with the citywide youth coalition. We've got enough going on in New Haven. We don't have to go beyond our city to see where the challenges are. We've got legislation that's already gone through here in Connecticut, trying to have major changes on the police, whether that's enough. I don't know. There again, that's reform. That's just another, oh, okay, now we can stop paying attention to how police treat people. Who knows? So if we can put that on the agenda, I think that goes to Carol and one of the heart of where we're challenged within one of our key testimonies. And I don't have the right answer to that either. But it feels like I can finally channel within myself a little bit of what it's like to never be safe. I know what it's like to not feel safe as a woman on streets, even in Madison. I can feel that way at the dark of night, but to never be safe. I think that's the way we want to try and think about the challenges that we're getting and what makes sense, both as an institution and as individuals.
Do you want us to read other parts of the book, Maureen? Or just?
I'm going to have you read all of chapter 11. I'll be sending this out now.
Okay.
So that's towards integration. And there's Vanessa's epilogue, which I think has excellent challenging in it. There's going to be Vanessa's interview on Quaker Speak about this issue. And there's another very good Quaker Speak by a woman that I don't know, but her experiences being a woman of color, first going into a Quaker meeting. I mean, she's very contemporary and she's very helpful in what it feels like to walk in the door. You can't assume you're going to be safe. And it's not because we're giving people bad looks or something. They're just not safe, right? They can't trust us until they know us. And it's too much work to learn to trust us, is the way I read it. And then there's, and I'll try, I think those are the basic resources. I've got a few other books, one by Hal Weaver. Some of you may know him from New England Yearly Meeting. But that would be more if you want more. I think that's enough to kind of wrap up. But maybe go back and reread the section, particularly on Black Power. That section there. I mean, it's so clear to me. It is history repeating itself. It's so agonizing. Can we do better? Maybe that's the best we can hope for. Can we do better? Who can we ally with? If we're small, then you say, who can we ally with? Right? It's also kind of arrogant to think that one congregation, it's not enough because it's institutionalized.
Can I just make a comment, Maureen? Jerry grabbed a book for me out of the library that has really been very enlightening. It's called We Can Do Better.
Oh.
I don't know if any of you have read it. It's very challenging, in your face, where white people have to get off. And I have found it to be very enlightening.
Okay.
It's also got a glossary about 15 pages long because we don't get all of the lingo that we need to get. So we can do better.
Okay. I wonder if that's sitting on the floor in my house somewhere. Piles of books.
It sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar, but thank you, Barbara. I'll add that to the resource list for people. Well, thank you, everyone. Are there any questions? So we're going to meet for our last session 2 weeks from now. And it'll be the same link, but I'll send it out again. I'll get the materials for session 3 now up on the web within the next day. And I'll send you a link to that. Carl sent me some work I have to do for the meeting tomorrow. So I'll get it out.
Shall we take just a few minutes in silence at the
That'd be
end
great.
here?
I'm going to go ahead and end the recording at this point.
Okay.